Here is what Navroczky actually planned. You will be shocked. Today, an explosion was supposed to rock Gdansk. A neighbor staged the battle for Kyiv on live air. Instead, Ukraine turned everything in its favor. Shocking details of a political knockout. Something went wrong in the Kremlin. Lavrov suddenly started telling the truth. Putin was made a fool of. Trump pulled off this clever scheme while looking the Russian dictator right in the eye. The Kremlin still cannot accept this defeat. Washington did the literally impossible. The White House is placing a laurel wreath on Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine is moving the war into a new phase. Statements that literally reveal the date when peace will be declared. And all of this happened right now. Greetings, I am Daryna Gutskalo and we are beginning. In Warsaw, a big game is suspected. In government circles, there is more and more talk that Navroczky might have tried to disrupt one of the key events related to the future recovery of Ukraine, the conference in Gdansk, which started just today.
Our source from the Prime Minister's office. Navroczky clearly wanted to create tension in relations with the Ukrainians and cancel Zelensky's trip to the conference in Gdansk. That is why he announced the award presentation a week before the conference.
At this very moment, the political and economic elite from all over the world are already gathering in Gdansk. The conference on Ukraine's recovery was prepared for months. More than 50 official delegations are expected to arrive, as well as over a dozen presidents, prime ministers, and other world leaders. However, as it became known, neither Volodymyr Zelensky nor Karol Nawrocki will be at this event. In fact, this is one of the most important international events dedicated to the future of Ukraine. That is why any attempts to disrupt or jeopardize this event are already causing a loud resonance far beyond the borders of Poland. In particular, behind the scenes, they say that for Karol Nawrocki, the problem is that he failed to block Poland's participation in the European Union's arms financing program, SAFE. And this in turn will play into the hands of Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
The White Eagle game, the battle of Navroczky and Tusk for Ukraine. Behind-the-scenes disclosure.
So as we can see, political passions are heating up, accusations are becoming louder, and behind the scenes they are already looking for those who could be behind the attempt to jeopardize the alliance between Ukraine and Poland. We are following the development of events. This is a real sensation. For perhaps the first time, Moscow admitted that Putin was made a fool of. An unexpected setup from his inner circle. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov suddenly announced that the Russian dictator was simply fooled during a meeting with Donald Trump in Alaska, where, as the Kremlin claims, certain agreements regarding Ukraine were reached. But Washington pulled off a clever scheme to buy time for supplying Kyiv with additional weapons.
I don't even want to suggest that Alaska, like the actions of the Europeans, was intended to buy time for the additional arming of the Kyiv regime. I don't even want to think about it. But in the end, it all turned out the way it did.
And that's not all. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry complained that after the meeting in Alaska, Washington not only failed to ease pressure on Moscow, but on the contrary, kept old sanctions in place and added new ones. Moreover, the Kremlin recalled Trump's loud statements about the need to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine. However, they now claim that they have not seen any real results behind these words. It seems that in Moscow, it is becoming increasingly difficult to hide disappointment with the development of events. The United States forced the whole world to hold its breath and literally bow before Kyiv. Deputy Secretary of State Jeremy Levin stated that Ukraine is now in a turning point phase and is effectively winning the confrontation with Russia. Such words were spoken against the backdrop of the Kremlin's growing problems and the successes of Ukrainian forces on the battlefield.
As of now, we are in a position where Ukraine is winning the war. At this moment,
at the same time, the official emphasized that even this winter, Ukrainians managed to change the dynamics, as in winter, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked Russian infrastructure on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Now is a very important moment. Ukraine can continue to exert pressure on the battlefield.
And here is a key signal straight from the offices of the White House. Donald Trump called Volodymyr Zelensky brave and said that he is doing quite well in the war with Russia.
He's doing fine. Look, no matter how you look at it, he's doing fine. He's at least holding on. Many people are dying on both sides, but I think he's doing fine.
Right now, the situation is changing dramatically. What until recently the Kremlin tried to dismiss as plans on paper is today turning into real decisions by the West. New programs for the production of long-range weapons for Ukraine from partners. In Moscow, the reaction to this is becoming increasingly nervous. The balance of power that Russia tried to maintain is beginning to wobble, and the front is receiving new factors of influence. Are we really entering a stage where the initiative is gradually passing to Ukraine and its partners? And what consequences will the new arms race have for the further course of the war? More on this in the report. What the Kremlin has feared in recent years may become a reality. The West is not only not reducing military support for Ukraine, but is also starting to launch the production of a new generation of long-range missiles. And if the plans of defense companies are implemented, the count could go to hundreds and even thousands of high-precision weapons for the Ukrainian army. The first wake-up call for Moscow was the news from the Netherlands. There, they announced the financing of the production of 700 long-range cruise missiles from the company Destinus specifically for Ukraine. And this is just one program. In parallel, reports continue to circulate about Ukraine's use of new long-range ERAM missiles with a claimed range of over 930 kilometers.
The most interesting part isn't even that. According to some estimates, we could be talking about future deliveries no longer in single batches, but on a scale that will be counted in the thousands. For the Russian military command, such a prospect looks almost like a strategic nightmare. After all, if before one could try to hide warehouses, headquarters, and military plants somewhere far in the rear, now the very concept of safe depth is beginning to crumble. From Belgorod to the Urals, from military airfields to defense industry enterprises, all of this is gradually falling into the zone of potential risk. But the real intrigue is unfolding in Great Britain. Defense giant MBDA reported successful tests of the new crossbow drone missile. And here, what's especially painful for the Kremlin isn't even the range of 800 kilometers or the warhead weighing 300 kilograms. The speed of development is impressive. Only 9 months passed from the emergence of the idea to the finished prototype. In fact, the British have demonstrated that modern high-precision weapons can already be created faster than Russian officials can write another report about having no analogs. And crossbow is just one part of a much larger story. Within the British Breakstup project, several more long-range systems are being created in parallel. For example, Tiger Shark is capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 1,000 kilometers, carrying a warhead weighing 300 kilograms, and its cost is just over $500,000, which by modern military standards looks like an almost budget option. Even more interesting is Sky Lens, with a claimed range of up to 1,200 kilometers. One detail adds a special piquancy to the situation. All these systems are created according to the ITAR-free principle. In simple words, without American components that could restrict the transfer of weapons to third countries. That is, the British deliberately designed these missiles in such a way that in the future they could be transferred to Ukraine quickly and without unnecessary bureaucracy. For the Kremlin, this is a very unpleasant signal. There are fewer and fewer political levers to block such deliveries. What looks most symbolic is how the West's approach itself has changed. If at the beginning of the full-scale war, the Allies argued even about the transfer of individual artillery systems, now it is increasingly about joint production, multi-year funding programs, and the creation of entire lines of long-range weapons specifically for Ukraine's needs. In fact, a new defense ecosystem is being formed in which Ukraine is no longer just a recipient of aid, but one of the key centers of future European security. It's funny that Putin started this war under slogans about the demilitarization of Ukraine. A few years have passed, and now Ukraine is gaining access to technologies it could only dream of before. The West is launching new production lines, funding hundreds and thousands of long-range systems. If these programs are implemented even partially, then for many Russian facilities, the coming years may turn out to be much less calm than the Kremlin is used to counting on. For Russians, night alerts are becoming as common a part of life as morning coffee. Before Moscow could recover from previous attacks, the sky over Russia and the occupied territories was again filled with the sounds of explosions and sirens. It all looked most symbolic in the Russian capital itself. While officials reported on more successful interceptions over the Moscow region, drones flew by one after another. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin spent the night counting new targets approaching the city practically in real time. According to him, nearly 60 drones were allegedly shot down on the outskirts of Moscow. The irony is that the more such reports appear, the harder it is for Russians to believe the fairy tales about the capital's absolute safety. Powerful explosions were also heard in Bryansk. Holy shit! Not bad. According to local sources, railway infrastructure was hit, one of the key arteries through which Russian military logistics are supplied. For the Kremlin, this is a particularly painful topic because while generals dream of new offensives, more and more rear facilities are forced to think not about transporting cargo, but about their own survival. It was no less hot in occupied Crimea. There, explosions were heard in several areas of the peninsula at once. The Navroczky thermal power plant near Simferopol drew particular attention, one of the key energy facilities that Russia once built as a symbol of the final integration of occupied Crimea into its own system. Now this symbol is increasingly in the news due to damage, fires, and the consequences of attacks. After previous strikes, burnt-out structures, holes, and serious destruction had already been recorded there. Events in Armyansk unfolded even more interestingly. According to preliminary information, the strike hit the FSB border service building near the railway station. After the explosion, a fire broke out and witnesses reported further detonations. When security forces' facilities start exploding, even the most convinced supporters of Kremlin TV shows suddenly start asking very uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of the entire defense system. Reports of explosions also came from Donetsk and Berdyansk. In the latter, the railway station area drew particular attention, where a fire broke out after the attack. And this once again demonstrates one simple trend. The geography of strikes is constantly expanding, and the list of facilities that the Russian authorities considered relatively safe is rapidly shrinking. The final statistics from the Russian Ministry of Defense look particularly telling. They claim that 301 Ukrainian drones were allegedly shot down in a single night. And here a rather awkward paradox arises. If the threat is indeed so massive that they have to report on hundreds of targets over dozens of regions, then Russia itself is effectively admitting that the air war has long since moved far beyond the front lines. While Kremlin officials keep talking about having the situation under control, Russian regions are increasingly waking up not to alarm clocks, but to explosions. And it seems that for many residents of Russia, this is becoming a new, very unpleasant reality. Sensation. China is taking the last of what Russia has. Beijing has finally brought Putin to his knees. Xi Jinping is lining his pockets with Russian money and cutting off entire regions from the ally. Trump watches this with a smile, while the Kremlin can't come up with a plan B. The valves are tightening and it seems there are no allies left. Will China have enough stamina to continue acting unprecedentedly and finally shut down the empire? More on that in a moment. China is devouring Russia, quietly without unnecessary words. Xi Jinping is taking territories and Putin gladly gives them up and bows at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw material appendage with a long Chinese contract. A clear example is the Zashulanskoye coal field in Transbaikalia, which is being developed jointly by the Russian Onplus Group and the Chinese Shenhua Group. The project is designed for a century of extraction, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In fact, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, where Beijing becomes the main beneficiary. Starting in 2027, they plan to send about 5 million tons of coal to China from here annually. That's hundreds of trucks every day. New routes are being laid literally through forests near mineral water springs and nature conservation zones. Ecology, it seems, acts as a secondary detail in this system, which was simply not included in the business plan. In parallel with resources, China is actively entering the region through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourism infrastructure is growing to cater to Chinese visitors. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, pushing out local entrepreneurs. According to various estimates, up to 2 million citizens of the People's Republic of China may already be in the Far East. And against this backdrop, it looks less and less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reshaping of the region to suit Beijing's interests. And while Russia is gradually turning into a resource periphery for China, even harsher scenarios are appearing in the Chinese information space. No longer about cooperation, but about the actual division of Russian territories in the event of a crisis. And surprisingly, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. An article appeared in the Chinese media directly discussing potential control over 7 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East in the event of an internal collapse of the Russian Federation. The authors point out that due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have been moved to the west, leaving the eastern regions virtually empty with minimal military presence and weak control over the territory. The economic conclusion sounds even harsher. Russia, according to the authors, is rapidly degrading and its economy is allegedly smaller than a single Chinese province. And here cold logic already appears. If the center of the Russian Federation weakens, the Far East and its resources must not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation around Crimea. Instead, a different approach is proposed: soft absorption through investments, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region, which formally maintain independence but effectively become dependent on China. In fact, the text conveys the main idea bluntly. Russia no longer seems capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, seizing the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analysis, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public space looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of a post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can we move forward with confidence.
Or perhaps the Celestial Empire won't wait for the Russian Federation's collapse but will speak the language of force. China is building a giant military mega-complex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already saying outright they have never seen anything like it. It's a new strategic zone near intercontinental nuclear missile silos where, according to Reuters, over 80 launch pads, bunkers, a rail hub, airfields, and command centers are being built. Effectively, a full-scale military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 giant octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest they could house electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems. But the key detail is no one knows exactly what is inside, and it's this very uncertainty that scares analysts the most. In fact, this is an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture amid escalating confrontation with the United States, especially over Taiwan. In the desert, not just a military base is rising, but a new level of strategic reality where Beijing shows its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to grasp the scale of what's been seen, experts admit they've never recorded such a level of military construction in the era of nuclear powers. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia increasingly looks less like an independent power center and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. The Celestial Empire isn't acting abruptly yet, but it seems Putin might live to see the day when Xi Jinping takes what's his suddenly and without warning. Urgent: an explosion in Moscow's offices. Tension is rising within the system, and strange events surrounding Putin's inner circle are raising more and more questions. Peskov suddenly drops the propaganda microphone. The Kremlin's financial savior Nabiullina is tired of hiding secrets, and the mayor of the Russian capital, Sobyanin, has even decided to defect to Ukraine's side. What secret wars are already raging within the Russian elite? And is the Kremlin approaching a crisis that can no longer be hidden? We're telling you right now. The smell of personnel panic is back in the Kremlin corridors. For several weeks now, Russian telegram channels have been relishing rumors that Dmitry Peskov might never return from his vacation to his post as the Kremlin's chief voice. Rumors are swirling that Putin's longtime press secretary might be sent far away from Moscow's intrigues into a diplomatic exile under the fancy guise of embassy work. And while Peskov himself remains silent, Russia's information space has exploded with a new theory. Supposedly, Dmitry Kiselyov is being considered for his spot, a man who for years turned television broadcasts into a factory of propaganda and apocalyptic forecasts for the West. It seems the Kremlin decided that if reality is becoming harder to explain, then they need a specialist with an especially powerful imagination. Some are already joking that the personnel changes might be linked to the fact that lately Peskov has been appearing too often at various social events and parties suspiciously far from state work. Or maybe the reason is much simpler. The Kremlin traditionally looks for someone to blame for failures. And when there is no good news, they have to change at least those who announce it. To be fair, for now, all of this remains at the level of rumors and insider tips. However, when even the chief Kremlin spokesperson suddenly finds himself at the center of personnel gossip, it may indicate that nervousness in Russia's halls of power continues to grow. At the center of another conflict is the main guardian of Russian finances, Elvira Nabiullina. After a mysterious 2-week disappearance from the public eye, she finally appeared at a briefing, but instead of soothing tales of stability, she brought Putin a new batch of unpleasant news. The head of the central bank effectively admitted that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries could trigger a new spiral of inflation and hit the country's economy hard. It seems Nabiullina is increasingly saying things that the Kremlin would prefer not to hear. While propaganda reports on an economic miracle and resilience to sanctions, the head of the central bank stubbornly points out risks, deficits, and budget problems. The situation with the ruble could cause particular irritation. The Russian currency unexpectedly strengthened, but instead of a triumph, it turned into a headache for the authorities. Exporters are losing profits, the budget is missing out on billions, and economists are already warning of a multi-trillion hole in state finances. Against this backdrop, Russian elite circles are increasingly discussing the future of Nabiullina herself. Her term ends in 2027, and rumors about the search for a successor have long since moved beyond the corridors of power. Various names are being mentioned, but the main question is different. Has the head of the central bank become too inconvenient for the Kremlin? And while Nabiullina was previously considered one of the most effective managers of Putin's system, now her position increasingly resembles a classic Kremlin trap. When the economy stalls, money becomes scarcer, and the war demands more and more resources, someone to blame will have to be found sooner or later. And it's quite possible that the role of such a scapegoat is already being prepared specifically for the head of the Russian central bank. The unpleasant surprises for the Russian Federation don't end there. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin received a very unusual gift for his birthday. While the official was likely receiving yet more congratulations from Kremlin colleagues, his Telegram channel suddenly turned into a platform for completely unexpected political statements. One by one, posts supporting Ukraine began appearing in the feed, along with openly mocking messages about the Russian authorities and war supporters. These were likely the most sincere posts ever to appear on the Moscow mayor's official channel. However, it didn't last long. After a wave of backlash, all the messages quickly vanished as if they'd never even existed. But the internet, as they say, remembers everything, and screenshots have already gone viral faster than Moscow officials could explain the situation. It's especially symbolic that the incident happened right on Sobyanin's birthday. Instead of birthday cards and pompous greetings, the mayor got a real information firework display. And if this really was a hack, the unknown authors decided to throw him a party in the style of modern Russian reality, with panic, chaos, and a total lack of control over what's going on. The Kremlin has spent years talking about total control over the information space, but sometimes just a few minutes are enough for the official channel of one of the country's most influential officials to become a news source that makes Russian propagandists clutch their hearts. It seems the Kremlin's main problem today is no longer sanctions or even Ukrainian strikes. The most dangerous enemy for Putin's system is becoming internal chaos, which is getting harder to hide behind propaganda, loud statements, and TV shows about stability. And the more cracks appear on the facade of this system, the louder the question becomes: is everything really as calm in Russia as they say on the screens? That's all for this edition. We're continuing right now. Follow the latest events so we can be the first to tell you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you.